South Americans emerging from a harsh winter, Miami is the ultimate playground. Life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. The carefree vibe here is the extreme opposite of the most infamous prison in the world, Guantanamo Bay on the island of Cuba, just over the horizon.
It's nice to just get out of there and get back home.
Apart from some military officers, no one knows Guantanamo better than the tenacious reporter Carol Rosenberg. She spent around 1,000 days there in the 12 years it's been open.
You fundamentally spend your time down there in military custody. They consider it their prison, not America's prison. They consider it their base, and they treat you as outsiders who need to be watched. So
it's more than a decade since I last reported from Gitmo, and since that's where we're headed, I wanted to get some insights from the Miami Herald team.
You just couldn't shoot anything. And I would ask, you would ask, can you shoot this? No. Can you shoot that? No.
We're not allowed to use his name. We're not allowed to use his code name that they introduced us.
Back at the paper, Carol and Jose Iglesias are going over what they managed to film the week before and what survived the military censorship.
But is it?
Look at that.
Oh, look at that. Oh my God.
Everything you ask, everything you want to do is viewed through a prism of suspicion. I believe that my role is to tell the story of Guantanamo to the American people, and not always, but frequently, the military down there resent that role. This is maybe the worst period of restriction on the media that I've experienced down there in 12 years.
Once we've passed all the security checks, getting to America's Caribbean naval base is actually pretty easy, just a commercial flight away from Florida. The US has claimed this mangrove toehold on the edge of Cuba for 100 years. The prison's history is much shorter, but the dilemma it's created is enduring. Six months after approaching the US Defence Department, we've finally scored a media tour with some British journalists. It's 12 years since I last made this trip. The Guantanamo Bay Detention Centre had just opened and America was still reeling from September 11. They said the prison was for the worst of the worst, that it had a purpose, that they'd try to get intelligence to stop any further attacks. It was meant to be temporary. I never expected more than a decade later I'd be back to try to find out why it seemed so impossible to close this place down.
On an island with nowhere to go, it's AFN Radio Gitmo.
It's 9:40 a.m. You guys are tuned in with your host, Petty Officer Yolanda Williams, aka Miss Peaches.
He's moving over to the relevant lane to take the fast track back into the start of the game and change the play. Now living with this past the race, checking over that shoulder, thinking us in this change.
Our tour begins where it all began, Camp X-Ray.
The detainees would get off the bus and file through this area right here, and if they needed to be showered or deloused, that was actually what that was over there.
I watched in early 2002 as they brought in the plane loads of shackled detainees. We felt the tension. No one knew what was coming next, only that these men were branded enemy combatants.
Camp X-Ray looked like a kennel. And the idea that we were going to keep human beings in a kennel in order to give them sort of safe, humane, transparent, all the terminology they use now for detention, was at odds with anything that I wanted for my country.
Guantanamo was a symbol of the so-called war on terror. The Bush administration set up a detention and legal system there which upended traditional American law. International condemnation was swift.
The criticisms of how they treat the prisoners are still irritating many of the military on the base here. It's one of the reasons they're putting so much effort into their public relations.
We want want maximum disclosure with minimum delay.
It wasn't true back then, and it's definitely not true now. Back in 2002 at least, I was able to interview service personnel, give them a name and a face. Now the paranoia about security has rendered our escorts faceless and nameless. To get on this tour, we've had to sign up to strict censorship rules, the toughest I've ever experienced in 8 years of dealing with the US military.
This is where one of the more infamous pictures was taken, where the guys in the orange jumpsuits laying down on the ground with their hands behind their back and the mask on. And the reason for that wasn't for humiliation, which unfortunately...
It was a military photo.
Yeah, it was a military release photo. It was a military release photo, and it didn't shed the best light.
It was a public relations disaster.
It was a public relations disaster.
The first of many.
Many, and there's a couple more in here. We'll move on.
It's astounding to think that of the first 20 detainees brought here in January 2002, 11 remain imprisoned.
Weeds have grown up and there's actually a few snakes around the place. You might be wondering why they've left Camp X-Ray like this. The reality is it was controversial when it was built, and it remains controversial. There's talk of lawsuits, lawyers who say this place was a crime scene, and so it's got to stay as is.
Guantanamo still holds 154 men. Most have never been charged or tried, and yet according to the most powerful man in the world, there should be none left here.
There is no force in the world more powerful than the example of America. And that is why I have ordered the closing of the detention center at Guantanamo Bay and will seek swift and certain justice for captured terrorists. Because living our values doesn't make us weaker, it makes us safer, and it makes us stronger.
President Obama made that promise 5 years ago.
In the first year, when they decided that they were going to close it, they didn't move fast enough. And Congress systematically imposed all of these regulations that have locked those men down there at Guantanamo.
Swift and certain justice.
Someone else who thought the end might have been in sight was the prominent lawyer Clive Stafford Smith.
Because living our values doesn't make us weaker, it makes us safer, and it makes us stronger.
Clive, who founded Reprieve, a legal charity, has helped 60 detainees leave Gitmo and still represents another 15.
But I've got to say, I never thought it would be as catastrophic as it's been, and it's still open all these years later. I've spent my whole life doing death penalty cases in the US, so I've been to most death rows in the US. And I can say without pause for contemplation that the conditions in Guantanamo are worse than any death row I've ever been to.
Ladies and gentlemen, Brigadier General Lehnert.
The Marine who set up Guantanamo Bay Prison in early 2002 was Michael Lehnert.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba.
The General was given less than a week to build cells for the first 100 prisoners. They were coming straight from the battleground, or so he thought.
Our detainee population is now 186. 2 days ago, we received 28 detainees. Most of these detainees had been wounded in earlier fighting.
I thought a lot about what to say tonight, and it's been over a decade since I deployed my command to Guantanamo to stand.
Now retired, Mike Lehnert shares his experiences with college students who were barely in school when America was attacked, and his message is blunt.
Should we close Gitmo? Absolutely. It's a blight on our history, and I say this as a man who helped create it.
I think that Guantanamo stands as a recruiting poster for terrorists. There's no doubt that even today, there are some very bad people down there who would do us harm. But at the same time, the United States should stand for something. Stand for the rule of law. Stand for the appreciation and respect for human rights. So as long as we have Guantanamo, it's very difficult to say that we stand for those things.
This is one of the few places where we can actually show you the exterior of the prison, and that's because Camp Delta behind me is no longer home to any of the prisoners. There's still a medical facility inside, but when we take you to Camps 5 and 6, where the bulk of the prisoners are being held, we're going to get a much more restricted view.
We do have an average of 60 to 70 detainees on a daily basis.
The prison tour proves to be unnecessarily hurried. We begin in Camp 5, a maximum security building currently home to 70 detainees.
I work here, so
it's a well-rehearsed script delivered without a hint of irony.
This is a typical cell in Camp 5. It meets all American Correctional Association standards. This is about 95 square feet of living space with about 80 feet of unencumbered space.
Orange jumpsuits are worn by prisoners considered non-compliant. Throwing feces and urine at guards is one method of protest.
If there's any type of behavior against one of our guards or anybody that works in here, then they would be put on a discipline status.
For those who behave, television is the reward.
They're given a remote control and they have about 25 channels to choose from.
So one person at a time, shackled to the floor, and they get 4 hours a week.
They're restrained to the floor, and yes, they do get 4 hours a week to watch television.
For some prisoners, resistance to detention is their key motivation. Undertaking a hunger strike is their weapon.
So the detainee movements...
When necessary, military guards physically manhandle prisoners, taking them to be force-fed. It's called forcible cell extraction.
Those are standard procedures.
Prison Commander John BOGDAN is one of the few officers we're allowed to identify.
Talk to me about forcible cell extraction. How often does that happen and why?
Well, I can tell you they're used frequently, and
What's frequently?
Daily. As far as why, it comes down to generally whenever a detainee refuses to comply or resists movement or assaults a guard force, anything like that. There's a host of reasons why it might be used.
It's a restraint chair that's used throughout every prison.
At the peak of the hunger strike last year, more than 100 prisoners were starving themselves. Those considered at risk were strapped down to have a tube delivering liquid food stuck up their nose twice a day.
If it goes in too fast, you get terribly sick, whereupon you vomit. Now, if you vomit, there's vomit all over you. They won't let you just stop. They just start the process again if you've thrown it up, but you've got vomit all over you. Then, because you're going to have all sorts of intestinal problems, they force some medicine into you. That force makes the guys end up defecating on themselves. And the thing that AHMED told me that was the most humiliating is having to sit there in his own feces for 2 hours while they wait. So they have to check that you don't throw the food up and you digest it.
I've heard of
the US military says these descriptions of force feeding are exaggerated.
In my experience, the majority of these guys the tube gets passed very easily and they take their enteral feed without an issue.
How many of them struggle?
Very, very few, I would say.
We asked to watch the procedure ourselves. Instead, we're shown an empty chair and hear an impassioned argument from the doctor in charge.
We're medical. We're not here to hurt these people. We're here to do a job to keep them alive.
It must frustrate you enormously then to see the reports suggesting that you're doing otherwise.
I can sleep well at night knowing that I'm doing the right thing and that I'm not doing what is being portrayed. Because 5 years from now, they're going to be alive, and it's because I kept them alive.
The former Guantanamo commander blames uncertainty for the problems.
My personal belief is if a detainee knew that they had 30 years to do, they'd figure out a way to do 30 years without doing a hunger strike. But when you don't know when you're ever going to get home, and there's a sense of hopelessness, it's probably the last thing that you have left.
What's happened now is they've dug in and they're angry. The guards are angry, the detainees are angry. I have said it from time to time, if they didn't hate us going in, they had to hate us leaving.
We get our first glimpse of a detainee at Camp 6, a medium security complex housing around 65 men. Many lawyers are adamant their clients want to speak to the media, but the military refuses, citing Geneva Conventions. It's a convenient cover. Those international rules about how prisoners of war should be treated carried little weight in Guantanamo's early days. We can see them, but they can't see us while they're exercising in this communal area. Anyone allowed here is generally following the rules.
So if a detainee is considered highly compliant, they end up in a cell like this. They've got a wash basin and a toilet, they've got bed linen here, they've got a mattress, and if you lift it up you can even see the arrow, which will tell them which way they have to kneel to pray.
But even those considered compliant say they're still subjected to humiliating body searches before or after talking to a lawyer, or even taking a phone call from one.
What they're doing is they're trying to make it so humiliating for the prisoners that the prisoners won't come to us to talk to us, to tell us the truth, and it's been successful.
I'm not the best Muslim in the world, but I do my best.
Prisoners do get out. RUHEL AHMED was one of the luckier ones, freed after 2 years. He's now happily married and a father of 3, but the time he spent locked up at Guantanamo was the hardest of his life.
So I knew they was trying to break me. For me, it was a fight, a struggle within myself to give in to them. Even though it was difficult, but I never showed it to my captors that I was struggling or I was suffering, because that was, if they seen that weakness, then they would have done it more. Ouch. Don't take your gloves off, okay? Until I say.
Now he spends his Sundays at home in the British Midlands, taking his kids to boxing class, just as he did as a child.
Push.
In 2001, he'd gone to Pakistan for a friend's wedding and crossed the border into Afghanistan. It had been a crazy adventure, but he was accused of fighting with the Taliban and was handed over to the Americans. He and other former inmates won compensation from the UK government, claiming British intelligence agencies were complicit in their torture.
If you talk about music torture, generally it was heavy metal, and I would play on for hours upon hours, and at the same time they would come and interrogate you, shout, excuse me, shout in the ear, are you Al-Qaeda, are you a Taliban, where's Bin Laden, and so on. So psychologically that would have an effect on you. Then you start hallucinating, seeing things, because of the loud banging noise of the type of music it is.
So how does a Top Gun like you end up in a place like this?
Yeah, that's a great question.
It's another picturesque Caribbean day. And Richard Butler, the one-time Navy pilot who flew in both Iraq wars, is now an admiral commanding Joint Task Force Guantanamo.
You enjoy it though.
Here?
Do you?
Oh yes, yeah, I do.
Does a year give you enough time to get your head around the challenges you're facing?
Barely. Barely.
Butler is fully supportive of closing Guantanamo, but staff rosters and repairs are being planned for years ahead.
If the president says we're going to close it, then we're going to close it. What I don't have right now, though, are detailed timelines of when that's going to happen.
The challenge for the Obama administration is to find countries prepared to take former prisoners. Uruguay in South America has been persuaded to take as many as 6. Spanish classes are underway. So is this helping improve morale in the jail?
You know, I won't necessarily speak for the detainees because I'm not going to make any assumptions that I know exactly what they're thinking, but the fact that they see others leaving is bound to give some of them a little bit of optimism.
One of the most controversial prisoners at Guantanamo is Shakarama, born in Saudi Arabia but a resident of the UK where his wife and children live. Shaka's been here for 12 years and has never been prosecuted.
I mean, we can't charge him with anything. We haven't ever put him on trial. It's not clear that he's done anything that constitutes a crime.
In fact, Shaka Armour was cleared for release way back in 2007.
Shaka went to Afghanistan not long before all of this happened, in June 2001. So when they got there, they had no idea that 2 or 3 months later there was going to be 9/11 and the world would descend into chaos. But that's what happened, and they got trapped in Afghanistan, turned over to the Americans for a bounty, and then tortured into making statements that kept them in Guantanamo for years.
Shaka Armour has repeatedly claimed that he was tortured at US bases in Afghanistan and also at Guantanamo Bay.
There's various other things I want to do to torment the British government about Shaka's case.
A few weeks ago, lawyer Clive Stafford Smith withdrew a case targeting British intelligence agencies over Shaka's torture in the hope that this may speed his release after 4,440 days.
So he's like a scapegoat, you know, them using him as a toy, like on a piece of chess. And that's what I believe. Because if he's been cleared by both sides, why is he still stuck there?
Shaka's lawyers have gone back to the federal court in the United States with a detailed medical assessment. It says he's suffering post-traumatic stress disorder, a host of other psychological problems. For his mental health, he needs to be released urgently.
How easy is it to take him out of Guantanamo from a cell, put him on a damn plane and fly him back to England? It's not rocket science.
More than 70 inmates, like Shaka Armour, have been cleared for transfer to their own country or other countries. The US now accepts that some committed no crime, or there's no prospect of convicting them of anything, even by a jury of military officers.
Your whole life is this insane process that you're being mistreated horribly and locked up indefinitely and never charged with anything and told you're cleared and not allowed to go home. And you just imagine what that does to somebody to have no certainty at all.
There is one area we've been unable to film during this tour or even learn where it is: Camp 7.
I'm currently suing the US government to find out who built it for how much and how much it costs to run it. They have spent 12 years inviting reporters down and saying, see, we show you everything there is to see. It's safe, transparent, and humane. And since 2006, they've hidden 15, 16 prisoners in a secret prison that they do not think the world should be allowed to see.
Why can't we see Camp 7?
That's a location that's classified.
You can't even point in the general direction?
No.
Camp 7 holds Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the alleged mastermind of the September 11 attacks, and 4 others claimed to be involved in the conspiracy. Another inmate is facing trial for the bombing of the USS Cole in 2000, which killed 17 sailors. All 6 defendants are facing the death penalty if convicted by military commission juries.
Well, I'm afraid if people say that the commissions exceed fair trial standards, I can only laugh. I've been involved in commissions. To call them a Mickey Mouse court is to be far too flattering to them and insulting to Disneyland.
We thought one day perhaps that Osama bin Laden would go on trial. And what we've gotten is his driver. What we've gotten is his cook. What we've gotten is his filmmaker, the propagandist who made a recruiting video for Al-Qaeda.
In fact, the recent conviction of bin Laden's son-in-law on terrorism charges happened not at Guantanamo, but in federal court in New York.
I think at least after...
Retired General Michael Lehnert says the trials of all Guantanamo prisoners should take place in US civilian courts. Anyone convicted should be jailed in mainland America.
Perhaps more of a response than the If there's anything that the US is good at, it's locking people up. We have the highest rate of incarceration of any country in the free world, and most of them don't get loose.
The military promotes transparency as one of its core values here, But the reality is there's a limit to what we've been able to see and what we've been able to show you. As for the future of Guantanamo, despite the whittling down of the prison population, it doesn't seem as if there's anywhere near enough momentum to close this place down.
Every morning, the national anthem can be heard across the base. A new day, but little changes for either the guards or their prisoners.
Well, the easiest thing in the world to close Guantanamo Bay down. The vast majority of prisoners should just get sent home. There's only a very small rump of people who need to be put on trial, and if they're convicted, you punish them, and if they're not, you set them free.
Guantanamo isn't just a place. It isn't just a base at the end of Cuba. Guantanamo is indefinite detention without trial for people held in a war that has nobody to surrender.
It's not going to close down. I don't think it will. It'll be a miracle if that closed down. It'll be a miracle.